So here we are at the Mystery of the Aztec Warrior. I'm picking up where Mrs. Malatesta left off. And she left off in the middle of chapter 2, an attic mishap. And where she left off, Chet Morton, the sidekick friend, just walked into the Hardy home. So I'm going to pick it up right there. In the background here, I'll try to scroll it from time to time, pictures of Aztec civilization. All right, so Chet Morton, here we go. Coming up the walk was a stout, good-natured looking boy, a schoolmate of the Hardys. Chet Morton was a particular friend and often, but unwittingly, found himself involved in the mysteries the brothers were solving. Hey, fellows! That goes back to the classic nature of you're going to hear fellows and some old-fashioned terms. Hi, fellows, he said as Joe opened the door and walked in. Why so glum, he asked. Something happened? Oh, nothing much, except that we rescued an unconscious man and we're searching for an Aztec warrior, Frank said nonchalantly. Chet's eyes bulged. You what? Quickly, Frank and Joe told their friends the story of the Moor mystery. Sounds crazy, Chet remarked, but the part about Mexico interests me. I've read some of that history myself. Say, do you know what those old Aztecs used to eat? No. They cooked with flowers, was Chet's surprising answer. The acacia flower was supposed to cure melancholia. They sprinkled the flowers into an egg batter, fried it, and covered it with sugar and cinnamon. Chet smacked his lips. I've always meant to try it. You suffering from melancholia? Frank teased. Did they use any other kind of flowers? Joe asked. Sure. They made pie fillings with roses, boiled them up with sugar and lemon, and they made a drink out of the old red blossoms from the Jamaica tree. You've heard of eating squash blossoms, haven't you? The Aztecs munched them during ceremonies to their rain god. Joe grinned. I'm sure Aunt Gertrude would love to make some geranium soup. Chet laughed. I just stopped by to ask you fellas if you'd be interested in going to a movie. But I suppose you'll have to stick around to solve this mystery. I'm afraid we will, Frank said, but we'll be in touch. Well, lots of luck to you, said Chet. As he left the home, Frank and Joe watched him roar down the street in his open, here's a word you don't hear every day, in his open jalopy. Then suddenly both brothers wanted to be on the move themselves. How about driving out to the Moore house tonight, Joe proposed. No restrictions on looking over the grounds. Sure thing. After supper, the boys took flashlights and set off on their car, with Frank at the wheel. When they reached the entrance to the Moore property, he stopped. Let's leave the car here, he suggested. The boys hopped out and started up the driveway. It was still dusk, so there was no need for their flashlights. As they reached the left side of the house, the brothers were surprised to see a plump, white-haired woman standing there, gazing upward. Hearing them, she turned. For a moment, she looked hard at the boys, then smiled. Good evening, she said. You startled me. I thought maybe you were burglars, but you're nice looking. Lads, my name is Mary O'Brien. I used to work by the day for the dear old gentleman who lived here. You mean Mr. Moore? Frank asked her. Mary O'Brien nodded. It was sad, his death, such a fine person. I enjoyed working for him. I was just reliving those nice times. Frank and Joe asked the woman if she had worked there recently. Not for a couple of years, Mary O'Brien answered. Lately, Mr. Moore wasn't here much. He traveled a lot, so he didn't have any regular help. Miss O'Brien, said Frank, did you ever hear Mr. Moore mention an Aztec warrior? A blank look came over the woman's face. I never heard of such a thing. Mr. Moore traveled a lot in Mexico, didn't he? Joe questioned. Oh my, yes, several times. He was a great one for bringing back souvenirs from there. What did he do with them? Frank queried. Well, some he kept and some he gave away. The boys asked her if Mr. Moore had ever mentioned any friends in Mexico or people with whom he had traveled. Mary O'Brien shook her head. To tell you the truth, Mr. Moore didn't talk a whole lot. He did say one time, though, that he was looking round Mexico for Indian weapons for his collection. A man traveled with him, but I'm sure he never mentioned his name. You say Mr. Moore had a collection of weapons? Frank asked. He did have, Mary O'Brien answered. He was talking about giving the weapons to a museum. I wish you could have seen them. I used to have to dust every one, and some of the old pieces were pretty deadly looking. And you never heard Mr. Moore use the word Mexico or Aztec in connection with any of the weapons? Joe questioned. No, he never did. The pieces came from Europe and Africa. Well, I gotta be going. Goodbye, boys. The same thought was running through the minds of the brothers. Could the mysterious property of the Aztec warrior be some kind of weapon? Frank and Joe walked silently across the lawn, past the front of the large house. As they looked down the right side of it, each gave a start. A man, standing on a box, was trying to get into a first floor window. Bum, bum, bum. That is the end of chapter 2. And chapter 3 is titled A Mysterious Companion. Why don't I get this started? At once, Frank and Joe sped toward the intruder. Unfortunately, the stranger spotted the Hardys. Jumping quickly from the box, he picked up a rock and threw it at the boys. Then he turned in the opposite direction and fled. The boys dodged the rock. Stop! Joe yelled, although he knew the command was useless. The brothers turned on their flashlights and dashed after the short, dark-haired figure, but he apparently was familiar with the rear exit from the grounds and disappeared among the shadows. Frank and Joe searched thoroughly, but the beams revealed only a series of dim footprints which faded out on a concrete path. I suppose we should report this, said Frank as they gave up the chase. I'll stay here and keep watch. Joe, you go and phone the police. Soon, 2 officers arrived in a patrol car and examined the area where the intruder had been. They lifted fingerprints which the man had left on the windowsill and said they would take along the box with the shoe prints on it. Thanks for the tip, boys, the driver of the patrol car said as the officers started away. If you see any more burglars, let us know. After the men had gone, Frank and Joe began their search for possible clues to the Aztec mystery. Beaming their flashlights around, they looked for some time with no success. Then suddenly Frank exclaimed, I think I found something. Joe ran to his brother's side as Frank focused his light on a large tree. Crudely carved into the trunk were the head and shoulders of an Indian. It's hard to tell what he represents, Frank remarked, but he could be an Aztec warrior. The boys examined the whole tree trunk, looking for more clues. Another carving? A hollow spot? Nothing came to light. Maybe something is buried in the ground near here, Joe suggested. There seemed to be no place within a radius of 5 feet of the tree trunk, which looked as if it had been dug up. The ground was level, and the grass was the same color and texture as the surrounding area. If something's buried here, we can't dig it up tonight, Frank said practically. Let's get Mr. Weaver's permission to do some digging here in the morning. I'm with you, his brother said. Frank and Joe returned home and reported their discovery to Mr. Hardy, telling about the collection of weapons. That's very interesting, the detective said. I'll ask Mr. Weaver about it. And I agree with you, there's a good possibility an object is buried near the tree. He phoned Mr. Weaver, who consented to having the area spaded up. He said he would meet the Hardys at the Moore estate about 9 the next morning. In answer to a question about the weapons collection, the lawyer said, Mr. Moore gave it away a year ago. I came across the list of items. None of them had anything to do with the Aztecs. As soon as Mr. Weaver and the Hardys arrived at the Moore estate the next day, Mr. Weaver produced spades, a shovel, and pickaxe from the garage. During the next hour, sod was carefully lifted, then deep holes were made into the ground. There were no signs of anything having been buried. Disappointed, Frank and Joe filled in the holes and patted the squares of sod back into place, got the garden hose and sprinkled the grass generously. Mr. Hardy said, Otis, if you can take the time, I'd like to go into the house and search through Mr. Moore's letters for clues to both Aztec warriors. The attorney consented, saying he would help, although Mr. Moore's more recent correspondence had been read. Frank asked, How about Joe and me looking through some more of the slides? Good idea, said Mr. Weaver. By the way, The police told me this morning that the fingerprints of that would-be intruder last night aren't on record, so he's not a previous offender as far as they can ascertain. And how about Mr. Brower? Has he regained consciousness? Frank asked. Not yet, said Mr. Weaver, unlocking the house. But his condition is better, and the doctors expect him to become conscious soon. The boys hurried inside. They immediately set up the projector and screen and brought out more boxes of slides. It was some time before they came across a second box of Mexican pictures, but in a few minutes Joe exclaimed excitedly, "Here's a real clue!" The picture had been taken in front of a pyramid and showed the mysterious companion of Mr. Moore in full costume of an ancient warrior. "Hold everything while I get Dad and Mr. Weaver," Frank said. He ran off to the library where the men were going through old letters and memorandums and asked them to come look at the picture. Said the detective after seeing it. "I believe this is an excellent lead. The man in the picture may well be the one Mr. Moore referred to as the Aztec Warrior. And is he the rightful owner of the property we can't find, Mr. Oh, and is the rightful owner of the property we can't find," Mr. Weaver added. "Who is he?" Frank asked. "Roberto or Hermosa or someone else?" "I'm sure this settles one thing," Joe spoke up, "and that is, the person we're trying to find is definitely in Mexico." Mr. Hardy smiled. "Come now, Joe, don't jump to conclusions. This does seem likely the man is in Mexico, but he might only have been visiting there." Mr. Weaver pointed out that even if this were the man they were looking for, there was nothing in the picture to indicate what the property was, which they should be returned to him. "What I can't understand," the lawyer added, "is why Mr. Moore put this whole stipulation in his will without giving the name of the owner. And why hold up payments to his beneficiaries until the mystery is solved?" Mr. Hardy asked. Frank remarked, "Mr. Moore might have been trying to protect both the owner and his possession for some special reason." And I'm going to leave it there, guys. Kind of